I'm Anna Gissing, one of the editors at IVP Academic, and today I have the pleasure to talk with Dr. Matthew Thomas about his new book, Paul's Works of the Law in the Perspective of Second Century Reception. It was just released on October 20th. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you.
So the title of your book has a lot going on in it, and I want to just break down the title as a way to get into the topic. What can you tell us? What's the significance of the phrase works of the law? Why does it matter how it's interpreted? Some people will already know a bunch about this phrase, and others who maybe haven't been immersed in Pauline scholarship may not be as familiar. So can you bring us up to speed a little bit with this phrase, works of the law?
Yeah, absolutely. It was great fun. I had the other day, I took a video of my son trying to go and to say the title of the book. And I took these videos of him over and over. And he's fairly legendary for being able to memorize long Bible verses. He could not memorize the title of the book because it was so long. So yeah, there's a lot that's going on there. I guess you could say the benefit to the book title is that it probably tells you a good amount about what the book is about and what it's doing all there. So what it lacks in conciseness, hopefully it makes up for in accuracy.
Absolutely.
What it's doing is it's getting at the passages in Paul's letters where he talks about justification and specifically being justified by faith apart from works of the law. That goes and shows up in Romans and Galatians, and these really key passages, which historically have just they've been very important. If you look in the Reformation period, they're very important. Just in the context of Paul's own letters, you can tell they kind of come at the climaxes of of his arguments, and so you can say they've been very, very combustible passages. And so with works of the law, you have, this is sort of the third term in this statement. So being justified by faith apart from works of the law. And the way that you understand any one of these three terms is necessarily going to understand, or it's going to affect what you understand Paul to be saying by the other two. And so the way that you understand, works of the law is going to influence what you understand by justification and what you think Paul means by faith. Just as some background, the way that I first got into this debate was when I was a master's student. This is about 10 years ago. I was writing a paper on justification for J.I. Packer, and for that paper, what I did was I took the two books that were pretty current at the time. So John Piper's book on justification, so the future of justification, and N.T. Wright's book, Justification, God's Plan and Paul's Vision, which I think is also published by IVP.
That's right.
I think both of them are actually quite helpful in sort of laying out from what we call the old perspective, what we call the new perspective on Paul, the way that these particular passages are interpreted. And as I was going through these two books and trying to wrap my mind around, hey, how does it, within this particular perspective, how are these passages read? Within this particular perspective, how are these passages read? What I kept coming back to is the difference between them on works of the law. And so if you look at justification, on that particular term, even if they weren't saying exactly the same thing all the time, they were at least sort of, they were, if not entirely on the same page, they were at least sort of in the same book, or like in the same chapter. They weren't that far off. And similarly with faith, when they talked about faith, I found that even if they weren't identical, they're pretty similar. When it came to works of the law, that's where it wasn't the same page. It wasn't the same book. They're totally different books in different languages. Just what they understood Paul to mean by what the works of the law, and what Paul's interlocutors were doing by practicing works of the law. There's a huge divergence that was there, and that then in turn that dictated what they understood Paul to be saying by faith in reaction to this when it came to debates over justification. And so for me, that was sort of the seeing that difference between the two sides went and led me to think, this seems like this is kind of the key hinge here that everybody's disagreeing on. And so I wanted to go and look into it more, which then ended up, going into eventually looking into what the early church goes and teaches on this. So,
So thanks for the background, the context.
Yeah.
After you got interested in this question, what did you do here in this book that's new, that's adding to the conversation so far? And I think that's where the next part of the title comes in.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's interesting. The credit for this project, I mean, one goes to J.I. Packer, because it was in his class that this got started. One of the things that Packer had us do a lot of is he had us read a lot of Calvin. So I got into reading a lot of primary source Calvin. So I had a chance to see the way that he writes, the way that he argues, and a lot of the nuances of what he does and doesn't do. And so, having done that, this was after I wrote that initial paper on justification. I was writing a paper specifically on works of the law because I wanted to focus on that, just because it seemed like it was the key sort of the hinge point between the old and new perspectives. And so I was doing research for this paper, and I had Calvin's commentary on Romans open up. And so I was in the Regent Library down in the basement over there, for anyone who's familiar with Regent College, it's in the stacks. And I opened to Romans 3:20, and in his commentary, Calvin goes and says, it's a matter of doubt, even among the learned, what the works of the law mean. And then he proceeds to go and to cite 3 early church fathers against his own position. So I think it's maybe it's Jerome, Chrysostom, and Origen, if I remember correctly, the ones that he goes and mentions there. Then he goes and says, well, then this is why they're wrong. And then he goes and, a paragraph later, he goes and says, I know that Augustine interprets this differently. And then he kind of goes and says why he's wrong too. And then he just kind of moves on. And for me, this was very strange, because I had gotten so used to anytime there's a disputed question, even if it's not particularly disputed, Calvin he's always bringing his friends with him. He always goes and brings the church fathers with him. If, at least in his view, if he thinks that what they're saying goes and supports what he wants to say, then he's going to go and cite them in his favor. And so if he's ever going to go and do that, he's absolutely going to go and do that here, on when it comes to the theology of, justification, what, more important place, could there be for this? And I'm looking on the page thinking, I must have missed something here. Because he always does it, and he doesn't go and cite anyone in his favor from the early church. And so I just stood there with the book in the stacks thinking, this is very interesting. I wonder why he doesn't go and cite the early fathers here. And I wonder if you were to look in the earliest reception of Paul, I wonder how they would have understood what Paul meant in the original context, or in the context that we have access to that are closest to Paul's own. I wonder what they actually would have meant by this. And I wonder what, how this sort of early perspective material, which is kind of the way that I end up, designating it. So you can say second century reception, you can say early perspective. For my purposes, those are synonymous. I wonder how that early reception would relate to what we're calling the old perspective on Paul, and what we're calling the new perspective on Paul. Because here we have Calvin, who's sort of your, number one old perspective guy. And he's looking at all of the really, really old stuff and saying, these guys are wrong. And so it's like, if the really old stuff is wrong, then what's actually really old in this debate, and what's actually, relatively speaking, new? And then, the third question is, if you look at that early material, what would it seem to suggest about what Paul means in his own context, if that early reception does go and say something, coherent and cohesive? So that's what, I mean, the credit goes to Dr. Packer, and then to Calvin for going and pushing me in this direction. So
they instigated you, huh?
Yeah, I know, absolutely. So I immediately went and started reading the early fathers, and started searching through everything I could find on these passages, and the way these passages were interpreted in the early church, because as I looked through, I couldn't find anything that was looking at the early interpretation of these passages and saying, hey, what would Paul's earliest readers, what did they seem to understand by these terms, and how does that relate to what we're calling the old and new perspectives? And so
that was why you were still at Regent that you started digging into that?
That was, yeah. So that was in my first year as a student.
Oh, okay.
So these were papers that I wrote in my first year, and which has been really funny, because the way that all these things come full circle. At the end of my first year, we had Alistair McGrath coming to give a summer course, and so I was there just auditing the course, and just because I benefited from his work elsewhere. And I remember it was clear as day. I was heading upstairs on the staircase, and Don Lewis, who's a great friend of ours from Regent, teaches history there. He's coming down the staircase, and he goes and he stops me and goes, I was like, oh, I have a meeting for you set up with Alistair today. I'm like, you have a what with who? And he goes and says, because I mean, I'm a first year student. I don't really know up from down. And and he says, yeah, I have a meeting for you set up with Alistair to go and talk about your PhD thesis. I'm like, what do you mean by PhD thesis? Like, I haven't even been here for a full year. But I think Don had, his sense is that there's something here. And so he set me up with Alistair. And so I had a chance to meet with Alistair back then, and kind of told him, hey, this is what I'm looking at. And it was really interesting having, I was afraid he was going to tell me, oh yeah, somebody's already gone and done all this work, everything like that. And so, sorry, kid. And he kind of stops and he says, well, the difficulty with PhD, theses is that there's so much written out there. There's so many people who have done so many different things. And so I thought he's just going to go and tell me, so this guy already wrote your thing. So you'll have to think of something else. And he stops and pauses and he's like, I can't think of anyone who's written anything on this. And I would love to see what you come up with. So you should absolutely go and do this. And he goes like, and you should probably go to Oxford, and you should probably go work with Marcus Bachmiel over there and Mark Edwards. And so it's funny how everything that, he sort of said at that meeting back in 2011, it all ended up, basically coming to pass. And so anyway.
So you did end up going to Oxford, and this book is the fruit of your dissertation and all of your research.
Yeah.
And I have been really impressed with the endorsements that have come in for your book by really top Pauline scholars across the field. And especially when I read for viewers a little snippet of Tom Wright's. He says the following about your book. Matthew Thomas has put us all in his debt with his detailed, patient, historically careful, and theologically explosive study. That's big. Can you say more about your findings and your conclusions that might really explode the debate about Paul's perspective?
Yeah, it's pretty unreal getting, getting something like that from Tom. I remember having a meeting with him at SPL this past year, and this is, I think, when he and Mike Bird were releasing their book, and so we were just meeting afterwards and talking, and it was very, very surreal experience, having him thanking me for my work, and quite profusely saying, this is so helpful, and this is something that needed to be written in for so long, and nobody's actually gone and done all the work this is. I just thinking to myself, what sort of weird parallel universe do I live in, where Tom Wright is like very enthusiastically thanking me for my work. None of that seems real, and I'm really grateful that the material does seem to be helpful for folks. And for me, I think one of the things that has been most encouraging is both for people like Tom, who are on the the new perspective side of things, and then for others like Doug Moo, who I engage with a lot in this book, who's more on the old perspective side of things, how both of them have found this material to be really, really fair and helpful and constructive for the debates, and to actually, pushing things kind of, forward. As I was working on the book, that was, for me, was a priority, is trying to just think, how can we go and, use this material to build common ground and common understanding, so that, these two sides aren't just talking past each other, because that was so much of what I, came across in the literature, was just talking past each other. And so that for me has been a huge encouragement, seeing that. I think when you're looking at the interpretation of works of the law and looking at the early reception of, what Paul meant by that, I think it's hard to avoid the conclusion that the entire old and new perspective debate is standing on its head, that we're calling something the new perspective, which is really in substance what the early church goes and says and understands what Paul to have meant by this term and by this phrase. And comparatively speaking, what we're identifying as the old perspective is something that you just can't find in an early reception. And it's, it's interesting, actually, in that, I go and I demonstrate that throughout the book. Not that that's sort of the thesis I'm trying to argue. I kind of try to let the material speak for itself, then summarize it at the end and say, boy, how does this seem to relate to what we're calling the old and new perspectives? And then when you look at the distinction between, what you find in the early reception and then the old perspective, it's interesting how both Luther and Calvin, they seem to acknowledge that their own readings themselves are distinct. And then you find this actually, I find quite entertainingly and more modern old perspective representatives like Rudolf Bultmann, who's one of the other major interlocutors in the book. And it's actually really fun how he goes and he looks at all this early reception of Paul, and it seems as though both what he understands Paul to have meant and also what he understands the Jews to have meant, both sides of this debate have disappeared from history for him and been replaced by something completely different.
Wow.
So I think that the way that we're talking, or at least in the past couple of decades, have been talking about, this is the old perspective, this is the new perspective. I think that the two sides are completely inverted, and I think that the data bears that out. I think I want to go and give I want to give proper nuance to that, because if you're looking at sort of the meaning of works of the law, so what works of what law are we talking about, and the significance of practicing, so what are you actually doing when you're observing the works of the law? I think that the new perspective is in reality the old perspective on this this particular issue. If you look at the broader question of why Paul opposes these works, that's something where you're going to get really interesting divergences in even just among sort of, if you're looking between Luther and Calvin, their reasoning diverges. If you look in the new perspective, if you look at Sanders, Dunn, and Wright, they all give you quite different, quite distinct emphases on this. And in that area, I think you're going to find that on the one hand, the new perspective, you can't even say it. Does all the early data go and substantiate? Because the new perspective, depending on who you're reading, is going to tell you all kinds of different things. And so while a lot of the reasoning from the early sources is quite close to what Wright is saying, there's a lot less substantiation for what Dunn is saying and what Sanders is saying as far as their distinctive emphases. On the other side, if you look at some of the anthropological reasoning that Luther and Calvin are getting at for why works of the law don't justify, there's at least elements of that are incorporated within early perspective reasoning. And so I think it's an important nuance to the debate to go into I guess you could say, to try to be as fair as possible to both sides as far as what the data bears out.
Yeah. So the IVP book is, I want to say, the third iteration of this material, if I can say that. So first you wrote for your doctoral thesis at Oxford, and then it was published. Tell us about where it was originally published.
Yeah, so I guess I could go through the whole story because so before it was an Oxford thesis. This is a paper at Regent, and so
Yes, right.
it started as a paper, which then it was actually it was really by the encouragement of Hans Borsma that he said, hey, you really got to get this published somewhere. And so he sort of helped to guide me in that process to get that published, which is an article in Canadian Theological Review, and then from there went and became the basis for the dissertation at Oxford. And so that was submitted, and then that was published 2 years later by Moore Zebak. And so the thesis itself was early perspectives on works of the law. I think that they wanted a
Okay.
more precise title, which turns
Okay.
into Paul's works of the law. And early
Yes.
perspectives and works of the law. I feel like my son might have been able to memorize that.
That's right. But this one is very precise.
This has the benefit of precision. The only slightly imprecise thing is that my own reading is I think that two of the sources that engage here. So the Didache and the Epistle of Barnabas. I locate both of those towards the end of the first century rather than the second century. So you kind of have to shoehorn those in. But besides that, it does have the benefit of accuracy. So it was published by Moore Zebak, which is a great experience, and it's an honor to go and to have anything do anything with them, and then that's where so Scott McKnight was one of the main people who helped to kind of get this material out there. And when you have a book with Moore Zebak, it's going to have a fairly limited readership just because it's a limited print run. And from a cost standpoint, it's going to be prohibitive for most folks to be able to actually get a copy. So I'd actually sent Scott a copy of this because I knew he was interested in his debate. So I'd emailed him, and he said, "Yeah, please send me one of these." And so a lot of it is from people like Scott going and popularizing it, that it kind of got around.
Yes.
So I think that this is probably part of your story as well.
Yes, I heard about it from Scott, who mentioned it several times to me, in addition to blogging about it. He just kept talking about it. And then I was at a conference where we read excerpts from your book. And so I had been thinking about the book and what you would do after this. And then we met last November in San Diego and talked about republishing this book as an IVP academic book. Can you tell us, I know you were talking to others as well, so what made you want to go with IVP Academic in the end?
Oh, that's a great question. I was really impressed with the plan that you had for the book. I think that the way that there is a vision as far as the significance, I think, that you saw the material and being able to go and to bring it to a broader audience, and the way that you wanted to do that. It just seemed like there was a lot of thought that was put into it, and which for me, I was that made a big difference. I had a chance to go through. So as part of my backstory, my background is working with young people, like an inner city ministry in Oakland. And so as part of that, we would have summer missionaries who were college students who would come, who were part of InterVarsity. And so they would come and they would stay in Oakland for about 2 months and just live there and be a part of the neighborhood and get to know our young people over there and everything. And so I developed a really positive view of InterVarsity from these young college age missionaries who come there. And I still kept in contact with them. A lot of them still kept in contact with our kids and everything. And so the name InterVarsity, just from that background, went a long way for me. And so I was already, I think, probably positively disposed. And then I went and I saw I went and I walked through your book table, which I believe is I can't remember if it was at ETS or SBL. But I went and I walked through there and saw all the displays and just thought, wow, they're doing a lot of really interesting work and a lot of really really important work as well. And they're putting out in ways that are seem really accessible. I mean, they have really fantastic covers. Just the way they do kind of all the different elements. I was really impressed with. And so I went and I sort of took what you had said to me, and I took it to some people who know a lot more than I do, and I sort of bounce what you had said, and what I had gotten from some other publishers who are interested, and just said, hey, what do you think about this? And everybody said, you should go for IVP. They're
Hey.
they're the ones for you. They're going to do a really good job with this. Everything on this sounds fantastic. And so that was already sort of what my own intuition was. But then having that confirmed by, you know, people who know the book industry far better than I do, that made it so it was a pretty quick process, because our turnaround for this has been pretty fast. It's been pretty remarkable. And I know that not every publisher is able, has a capacity to work on things and turn material around, as quickly as you guys are able to. So it's quite a credit to your operation there.
Thank you. Lots of people working lots of different roles to make books happen, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm really proud to have your book in our line. I think it's a really important contribution to Pauline studies. I think it will shape the future of the conversation. And so I'm really glad that you decided to have us publish the next version. And I wanted to talk just a little bit about the version, what's different about the IVP book.
Yeah.
So the arguments and the evidence are all the same.
Yeah.
As the previous version, what you've read reviews of. So it's the same book, but there are a couple of additions. There's a new foreword by Alistair McGrath and a new preface where you very briefly comment on a few things in the book that you have gotten responses about. And then you held up the book. It's got a beautiful new cover.
I can hold it up again if you'd like.
You can hold it up again.
There you go.
It's got a gorgeous cover and it has a great interior. And one thing I'm really excited
Vanna
about.
White here. I can go into the interior as well if you would like.
I'm really excited about how affordable it is for readers. The list price is $36, but it's on sale at SBL for SBL attendees, conference attendees, SBL members. And I think it should be affordable for many, many readers. And so I know that people have been talking about your research and wanting to read it. And I'm really excited that they will get the opportunity to afford it and to buy their own book and to read it. So if you have been waiting to get a copy, you can get it now. So I'm thrilled that to have you here, to hear you talk about your book. And I hope it will really reach many readers and make a big difference. Thanks for being here today.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for all of your work on this. It's really been a pleasure.